So we do have some pretty good time to have some discussion here. Maria, you were listening patiently and making notes, as was Bill, because you spoke first. So I will give you the first opportunity, Marie, just if you have some comments in response to Bill's presentation.
Thank you. Couple things. So one is regional proportionality. I actually agree with some of the criticism Bill has of dual member. For me personally, our position as a proponent organization is we're not taking a position on a specific system. But dual member is actually the only one of the three that does enable for province-wide proportionality. So a situation where you elect somebody locally, and then you end up with an MLA that comes from somewhere else. Both of the other systems are regional based, so proportionality is based on region as well, which means the Lower Mainland will not determine the outcome of the election. I just want to speak to the extremist argument a bit. I share Bill's concern about the rise of extremism, and I actually think some of what I spoke to in my initial slide, the alienation people have from politics, actually feeds that kind of radicalism as well. And I think that that's a problem that is plaguing countries regardless of their voting system. I do have concerns about how, under our current system, we can elect governments with less than 40% who have 100% of the legislative power. And I would point right now to the government in Quebec, who has said very directly that they're planning to use a notwithstanding clause to override individuals' rights, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, particularly around anti-immigration issues and some of the issues that Bill spoke to. So I think that danger is not going to go away by maintaining our current system, and that we actually have to double down and reinvest in our democracy. The other thing around the sort of tail wagging the dog, I have a hard time believing that either the BC NDP or the BC Liberals would work with a neo-Nazi party if they were elected in the legislature. So if a larger party does make a deal with a very extreme party, a fringe party, they need to answer to the voters for that as well. And so just the existence of a party in the legislature doesn't mean that they have any power. I think that's an important distinction. And with the introduction of LNG, I think there's questions about how much the Green Party actually is the tail that's wagging the NDP dog. The other thing I just want to speak to is around party control, and this notion that parties will have all the control under mixed member. They will certainly, or under proportional representation, they will certainly have some control. Right now, they have a lot of control. When we go to vote, we don't have the choice of, with mixed member in particular, there's an option of voting for a local candidate as well as the party or a regional candidate. Right now, if you like the local candidate in your riding, but maybe you don't like the party they're running for, or the opposite, you like a particular party and their leader, but you don't like the local candidate, you don't have choice. We're actually reducing voter choice in our current system. And under proportional representation, you would have the option of voting both for a local candidate, maybe that you have a relationship with, that comes from your community, as well as either voting for the same political party that they run for or a different one. So I think that's an important distinction as well. And then, Israel and Italy. I think that Bill likes to bring them up. I think there's a lot about those two countries in particular, Northern Ireland as well as one that comes up in this situation. There's a lot that's particular to their history and political culture that has more to do with the stability or performance of their politics than their voting system. And so maybe I'll leave it at that. I have other things to say, but we'll let.
Sure.
I'm sure Bill will say other things that will make me want to say other things. So.
And I have no doubt that while we're going to try to adjourn around 1:15, I'm sure both will be more than pleased to talk for a long period of time.
Give us a ride to the airport, you'll get an extra half hour.
Exactly. All right, a few questions that we had some discussion in the chamber before, just to get a little bit of a primer going here. Bill, I'm going to start, and both feel free to jump in and respond. There's been some mention through this, and you make mention of your background in fighting the HST. There are many in the room that would say, frankly, harmonized sales tax is the right way to go. They would suggest a slimmer tax code makes a whole lot of sense, but there's not been a whole lot of movement on that. But what's interesting on the HST and the discussion on the harmonized sales tax was it was as much about the process and creating a lack of trust from the get-go that led it to failure as the initiative itself. So it's certainly there's a lot of research with respect to engaging people early so that they understand and are part of that decision-making process. Are we seeing, and there has been some that's saying this is the NDP's version of the HST?
Yeah, I hope so. That would be good. That would work for me. The process is completely wrong. I mean, and I don't take any happiness in that as a New Democrat. But the public consultation consisted of a single website that anyone in the world could access and fill out the questionnaire multiple times. They could do it on their cell phone, their tablet, their home computer, their work computer, all of those sort of things. And as opposed to not a single public hearing, not a single meeting, not one here in Kelowna, not in Vancouver, not in Prince George, not in Kamloops or anywhere else at Kootenays. There were no hearings at all. And yet David Eby, the Attorney General, who is in my MLA, and I know him quite well, said, well, this is the greatest public consultation ever. Well, it wasn't. It really wasn't. Now, when you compare what happened, and I didn't agree with the previous circumstance that Gordon Campbell did in terms of the STV result, but they had a citizens' assembly. They chose people from around the province. They got together. They heard a bunch of stuff and decided to propose the single transferable vote. And while I didn't agree with that and opposed it both times, there was a process and people could see it. Particularly in 2009, we actually had riding boundaries which showed what STV would look like. Now, the fact that some of the ridings were as big as Germany might have been a problem. The fact that there was a riding that included the Georgia Strait, so constituency meetings might have been a bit of a challenge for people on either side of the Great Waters there. But that said, people could figure it out. By comparison, there's not one person in this room, including Maria and I, who could tell you what riding we will definitely be in at the end of this referendum process. We are going to vote without knowing that. There's not one person in this room that can tell you or tell me how many MLAs will be in my riding. Could be 1, could be 7, depending on the system that's chosen. Those are not minor details. Those are fundamental parts of any electoral system. And I'm sure Maria will probably say, because we've done this a couple of times, well, the Electoral Boundaries Commission, which is independent, will decide the riding boundaries. But they have to have instructions. They have to have instructions from somebody to say how you're going to draw this up. How many ridings are there going to be? There's going to be 87 or 95. Okay, that's fine. Is it going to be dual member proportional, where every riding is double? Is it going to be mixed member proportional, where it's going to be 40% bigger of every riding and to get the 40% MLAs by party list? We don't know any of that. This is not the way to decide on, and I really appreciate the BC Chamber of Commerce position on this by being neutral but criticizing the process, because it is a terrible process. It's so bad that what we've said at the No BC Proportional Representation Society is do not fill out the second part of the ballot. Don't give it legitimacy for a process which is completely flawed. Vote for first past the post, in our view, or if you don't, whatever, but don't vote in the second part, because it is unfair to ask people to make a decision on the most fundamental aspect of democracy, how you're governed, without any of the appropriate details you need to make that decision.
Maria, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not going to defend the process. I think there are problems
go ahead,
with it.
go ahead.
I'll leave that to the government to do, and I think, frankly, there'll be a lot of work for the government to do on the other end if we're able to be successful in this. I think that the distinction for me is that I don't take a position that our current democracy, our current voting system is working so well that the opportunity to improve it, that we shouldn't take that opportunity. And as Bill mentioned, I think that there needs to be a lot of process on the other end to build legitimacy and consensus and support for this in the event that it's successful. But I think essentially those who are just making a decision around whether or not to change the voting system are really going to look at this question around how well is it working. And I think that's where you see a really big divide in our province, and you see it based on age and some other factors, primarily age. There's actually not a huge distinction in terms of people who support or oppose the change based on rural, urban, or income and whatnot. It's the biggest distinction is young people, people under the age of 35 and people over the age of 55. So, I mean, I do think that the Electoral Boundaries Commission will need to do a public process around engaging citizens around those boundaries. There's going to be an all-party committee that I think needs to travel the province and engage with people as well. If there are too many unanswered questions for you, then you're going to vote no. And I think that's really what, for me, there's not, knowing the criteria on the other end, I think the fact that we have a commitment to no more MLAs than 95, no region of the province to lose MLAs, the 5% threshold, and then I think very importantly, a referendum after 2 elections. For many British Columbians who are dissatisfied with our current system, but unsure about the next, what the alternative would be, want to know what that ballot looks like, want to know what their riding looks like, want to see how government behaves under a new system, we have the opportunity to do that and then review. And I will note that no jurisdiction that has moved to proportional representation and then held a referendum, and there's been multiple jurisdictions that have done that, has gone back to first past the post. So,
I'm going to ask you a question. Hopefully everybody in the audience has received their information from Elections BC. Bless the hearts of the communications people that had to put that together. It should be coming shortly, as long as we don't have a postal disruption, which might change the whole world with respect to this, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm curious, the challenge that I think we're hearing from people is first understanding what the options are. The second, if this is about test driving a car, tell me not the features of the car, but how it operates. So I'm going to pose to both of you, it's interesting, there's great discussion about the changes to legalize cannabis. One would wonder how that first issue would have been identified and dealt with if we had proportional representation, maybe sooner, maybe later, maybe not at all. But let's use 2 BC examples, and let's look at the resource sector. The pipeline and LNG. With a proportional representation, if indeed this was to pass, and depending on what those 3 variables would be, how are the decisions first being identified, by whom, how are they prioritized, and then how are they likely to be dealt with that might be different than what exists today? And I'll put that in context because there's a lot that suggests the election was won because tolls were removed on a bridge and a lot of effort was in one riding in North Vancouver. So what's the test drive of this vehicle, if it succeeds, look like on those major issues? And either can go first.
Well, if I can, I like the test drive analogy, and I was going to respond to Maria as well. I mean, this is kind of like buying a car and you say, can I look under the hood? No. Can I take it for a test drive? No. Do you want to know what kind of tires on it? No. But if you don't like it, bring it back in 8 years. That doesn't work for me for some reason. But let's be really blunt here, and this is not an attack on the Green Party, but in the negotiations, if proportional representation is successful, and if the Green Party has what they had this time, 17%, Andrew Weaver will be the Environment Minister. No question about that. And whether it's with an NDP government or a BC Liberal government or some other strange coalition that comes out of this political Pandora's box, Mr. Weaver, if he has 17%, is going to demand to be in the government, and he won't be demanding to be there alone. That's what we've seen consistently in coalition governments throughout the province. So the entire question of how we do our resource extraction, and I work with miners and longshoremen and railway workers and others in resource extraction, I'm proud of that, and steel workers and et cetera. And if you have a party which has a significant grasp on the majority, unless you see a grand coalition of 2 other or 3 or 4 other parties and they're excluded, you're going to see a dramatic change in the way we handle our resources in this economy. Mr. Weaver wanted to and didn't negotiate properly, might say. He wanted to stop Site C, which I supported. He wants to stop Kinder Morgan, which the government position is. There's not a problem there. He doesn't want LNG to go ahead at all. He's being kind of cajoled, I would say, quite honestly, partly because proportional representation is on the line. And I asked the question, would he be willing to even consider LNG if this referendum wasn't on right now? And there's all sorts of issues that will come up in the future. So, we talk about and Maria talked about collaborative and cooperative decision making. The reverse of that is absolute paralysis, an inability to get anything done. And when we look at proportional representation in other countries, Belgium, 589 days to form a government. They went almost 2 years without a government actually taking office. It was run by bureaucrats and caretakers, and there was no ability to form a majority government or a coalition government for 589 days. Now, I can't imagine. We saw Germany. With all of the turmoil going on around the world, it took them 4 or 5 months to come up with a government. This is a recipe for political instability writ large.
Maria, do you have some thoughts? And the other piece, when I talked about LNG or Kinder Morgan, the other one is carbon, putting a price on carbon. Mm-hmm. Those are pretty significant policy issues that we've dealt with in some regard in the Parliament. How's that changed? And if you could, does it change of how it be identified depending on which of the three proportional representation options. that are
Yeah,
being
I,
presented.
yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that one. What I will say, I mean, to me, this brings up the slide that I showed around policy lurch, right? One government comes in. We heard, certainly with Site C, there was an effort to get it past the point of no return. You don't have that stuff with coalition governments. I think that what we would see under proportional representation is things might take longer, but I don't think we would see the divisiveness that currently exists in BC around these issues. And so the pipeline in particular, I mean, both the Site C and LNG are going ahead. I think that there's frankly a majority within both the BC Liberals and the BC NDP that support these issues, and that would likely come together in government. But it would be a more collaborative process. There would be necessarily more engagement with the public, and I think it would be less divisive. And what that means, would it take longer? Sometimes it would. I don't. Coalition governments, they're less expeditious, I'll guess, than majority governments. But you know what gets things done really, really quickly are dictatorships. So I think there's trade-offs in terms of how quickly do we push things forward and then get a lot of blowback from the public and from opposition groups, or do we work collaboratively to basically work these things through and ensure that they're in the best interests of all British Columbians? I'm not sure we would end up at a different point with any of those three big projects. I think that they're reflective of where the majority of the public is at. And the other thing that I think is really relevant that the pipeline brings up is the fact that there is an unanswered question in this province that creates, in my opinion, instability and uncertainty based on the fact that our relationship with First Nations and the unceded territories. So that is also something that needs work, and that would, again, requires a more collaborative and deliberative process than our current sort of divisive, partisan, politic-oriented legislature enables.
But can I just briefly
respond? Bill, real quick, and then we're going to go
Yeah,
to
and then I
some
do want to get questions. I think one of the fundamental problems we have in this debate is that the problems that Maria is identifying, other people are identifying, are not going to be solved by a different electoral system. Politics will exist whether you're in Ireland or Italy or Germany, New Zealand. If you want to make these changes, the things that need to be changed to do that are actually parliamentary or legislative. So, for example, I've written about this before. You could have a situation where the budget has to be passed by 60% of all MLAs, which would require almost every government that we've had to go to the opposition and negotiate that. You could have mandatory voting, which Australia has, and 94% of people vote, and there's no voter suppression, and every constituency and group has to be treated properly because they're going to vote. They have to. And 33 countries around the world do that. You could have a cabinet that exists, and then the caucus gets to, you'd like this, Rick, caucus gets to elect a member secretly to the cabinet, and they can't be fired by the premier. And they would give the premier the bad news from time to time because they would represent the caucus. But these are changes that have nothing to do with the electoral system.
And I agree with those changes, and I think they would be good. The problem is you get a majority government in and they have no inclination to make these changes. The power resides in the Premier's office primarily, and once they're there, these are all good ideas when you're on the outside looking in, and then you achieve that level of power in the Premier's office. It's a low priority to do this fundamental democratic reform, but I agree, I would support those kinds of changes as well. I don't think that changing our voting system is going to change all of this, but it's a necessary start in my opinion.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next stage of people. If you have questions, if you could just put up your hand, I'll try to move through the room. So we'll go there and then we'll come back this way. The throwaway I wanted to quickly ask you as I make the transition across the room is...
It's not a big room.
if you fix the recall and initiative, couldn't you address a greater democratic movement by lowering the threshold for initiative?
I mean, yeah,
I think there's recall for accountability.
I think there's a number of things that could be done, and I want, I would love to have a broader discussion around democratic renewal. But the safe seat, swing seat remains an issue because it's really, really hard to remove an MLA from a safe seat. And as you mentioned with the tolls, right now with swing seats, we have politicians on both sides catering to a very narrow group of voters to determine a very large electoral swing.
I think, just to add, I think if you change I'm in favor of changing the initiative threshold for sure, having been involved in the only successful one, which was crazy to do. Recall, I think it should be a little bit easier, but it could be perpetual politics where one side takes on the other side throughout, and it just causes more instability.
Just a practical question. There's two questions on the vote or referendum. So let's say you don't know your answer for the first question. Can you answer the second question? If you vote no for the first question, can you then vote for the second question? Can you just talk about the practicality of the options for the voting, and if you what would count as
Yeah.
a ballot that would count?
Yes, so yes to all of your questions. You can answer the first question only. You can answer the first question and the second question. You can answer the second question only, or you can not mail in your ballot. But I don't recommend you do that. So yes, and none of them they all count. None of it would spoil your ballot.
But if you vote only on the second part, you won't be voting for or against proportional.
Yeah, the first question is
So-
the key question.
Yeah.
Because without the first question, the second question doesn't matter.
Could I just add, just so people know, because a lot of this is informational, the second part is a ranked ballot. So you can mark them 1, 2, 3, you can mark them 1, 2, you can mark it 1 and leave the other 2 blank, and so on. So it's complicated and confusing.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot of argument about why we should change the system. What I haven't heard, and what I'm still, frankly, a little bit ignorant about, is how each of those options, what they each actually mean. The way I read the first option, it looks like it's still first past the post, but it is on a party basis. So, Maria, you are proposing the
Yeah.
changes. Can you explain each of those three
Yeah.
options?
Thanks, Maureen.
Yeah, and they're mixed systems. So you're right. In each of the three options, there's an ability. You're first and foremost still electing your local MLA, and I call them mixed systems because some of the systems that Bill's referring to are list-based systems, province-wide or country-wide. And I'll actually just make a note that every jurisdiction that uses ProRep, almost all of them use a slightly different version, and so there is an opportunity, I think, for us to have a made in BC version that takes into account our particular geography and demographics. The first one is the most similar from a ballot perspective to what we have now. You would have two. You would mark your ballot in one place. There'd be 2 candidates based on party, and as Bill mentioned, the first candidate, whoever wins, is the first MLA elected, and then the second one is determined based on proportionality. And that one is province-wide, so you could end up with a second MLA that's not necessarily the second place finisher in your riding. With mixed member, you have 60% of the ridings are first past the, or if 60% of MLAs are elected, as we do now with first past the post, you mark your ballot to pick your MLA. The remaining 40% are chosen through, based on party, through party lists. And so they would be elected on a regional basis. So you would basically be electing a local MLA and 2, 3, 4 regional MLAs. With rural urban, it's a combination. And so for larger urban centers, it would be STV, it would be a ranked ballot. And so you would have, depending on the size of the riding, anywhere from 4 to 7 MLAs, and you would list them in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, whoever you want to vote for. And the people with the most votes would represent the entirety of that riding. And then the rural areas would be based on the MNP model. So first past the post initially, and then a couple regional MLAs as well.
But if I can just add to that, though, that there is no definition of how many regions there would be. So there could be 2, there could be 10. We have no idea on that, and no idea what the size of them would be, as I said before.
Hi there, yes. My name's Justin. I'm a lawyer here in town, relatively new to the profession, like 2 years. I'm also part of that demographic that's under 35. I'm 31 years old. I've done a little bit of research into this. I'm obviously not as up to speed as each of you are. So, but in the research that I have done, what I've come across, and I'm gonna make a statement. I'd like to hear each of your thoughts on this. The research that I've done, Maria, you talked a lot about how under a PR system there would be more collaboration. I believe there'd be coalition governments. From my understanding, when I look at the literature and I research this, it seems to me that under our current system, under first past the post, it kind of tends towards 2 larger parties. Sometimes there's maybe there's a few more, but there's larger parties, and those parties, from what I see, at least here in BC, when I look at it, those parties are made up of various different groups, right? We look at the BC Liberals; they include, I think they call themselves like free enterprisers, right? Quite often. And they, be federal conservatives that fall into that category, federal liberals that fall into that category, and some outliers. You look at the NDP, same type of thing. I don't want to make huge generalizations, but progressives, right? So individuals that are part of the labor movement, people that are in unions, some environmentalists that maybe they're not caught by the Green Party, right? Again, there's some dissident members, like Bill was saying, but there's groups in each of those parties. So it seems to me that there is coalition building that's going on right now. But what's happening is it's going on before the election. And that's done, these individuals go to convention, they vote on the policy platforms, they debate it, it's done, and then they take a platform and they present that to voters, and then voters make the decision as they go into the next election who they want to form government, right, under our current system, who they want to vote for, which representative do they want to send, who's running, and they can tell what that representative is going to do based on what they say, but also what party they're signed up for, right? From my understanding, when you look at proportional representation, the platform doesn't seem to matter as much, right? It's after the election, there's many parties, they negotiate, and then they form a government, and they determine what policies are. So you don't really, it doesn't seem to me you know exactly what your government's going to look like as you would under a first past the post system. I'd like to hear what each of you has to say about that.
You want to go first? Want me? Well, I don't think they can answer your question any better than this. After the 2017 election, as negotiations were going on, and after the Green Party decided to have a supply and confidence agreement with the NDP, Andrew Weaver said that several things weren't going to happen. And he said publicly, NDP campaign promises are now irrelevant. So again, when I talk about tail wagging dog, that's the leader of the third party saying that the leader of the premier of the province and the party that's governing, its policies are irrelevant. So whose policies are relevant then? Mr. Weaver's, I guess. Those other folks. So I think, yeah, what you have is, you raised the HST issue, Dan, and I think, and you said the process was a big problem, and I agree, I think the tax was a problem as well, but the problem that Premier Campbell had is people perceived that he did not disclose that before the election. And that's one of the things that can get you in a lot of trouble. But under a perpetual minority situation, people will say, well, yeah, sure, I promised a chicken in every pot, but, the other guys wouldn't let me do it anymore, so don't hold me responsible. And that's not what we have now. We hold people responsible. We hold them individually responsible in our ridings or as leaders, in that case, and we hold them responsible as a party in an election.
Thanks. I have a question here, and then
Maria didn't get a chance to respond.
I'm going to come to Maria in a second. Just if you could put up your hand if you have another question as well. Maria, you want to comment?
Yeah, just quickly on that. I mean, I think what we see in the confidence and supply agreement between the NDP and Greens are a combination, it's selective of what was in both of their platforms. So there's nothing in there that wasn't in one or the other of their platforms. There's definitely stuff that's not in there that was in their platforms. But the decisions about what to prioritize were done collaboratively based on the discussions between those two parties. Very rarely, if ever, have we seen a government run on a platform, come in and deliver all of their promises. So they are prioritizing in government what initiatives they're going to follow through with and what ones they're not going to. So those discussions, I mean, I think to your point, those discussions are happening in both systems before and after the election. What you do get in a pro-rep system is a more accurate reflection in the legislature of where voter intention is at on various issues.
Oh, thank you, Anne. Maxine DeHart, Councillor DeHart. I just want to say thanks to the Chamber. As a local politician, we're getting asked about this vote, and I'm telling you, I'm so glad you did this because I didn't know what to say. So I'm going to fast forward a bit my question. We had a little chat at the table here. I understand, and if I'm wrong, just so some of us got this package, or we are getting the package, and then we have to vote, and it's going to be a mail-in vote. Well, this morning, most of us heard there's just going to be a strike on Canada Post. So how is that democracy, number one? What is the government, or what is anybody going to do about that? And how are we going to vote? Because this is very important, and I don't want to lose my chance. So what is what are we going to do about that?
Yeah. I mean, Bill, so there was a postal strike during the HST referendum as well, so Bill might be able to speak to this. Also a mail-in ballot. My understanding is what Elections BC did then was extend the voting period, the amount of time that the strike occurred. Now, of course, we're getting into Christmas holidays, into December. I certainly don't want to see that. So, I mean, I don't know if Bill has more to say on that, but I'm with you. I mean, I hope that that doesn't happen
Yeah,
because I think it's critical that people get
We've,
their
as our
ballots in.
group, has talked to Elections BC, and they will, and they'll probably have more to say about it the next day or two, but they will extend the voting period. I mean, I'll be blunt, you know, we have, both sides have planned for this referendum, and we've committed resources that can't be moved around. And so it would be unfortunate, I agree. I don't know how long the situation would go on. I guess on the, you know, I'm hoping that the ballots get out before anything significant happens, so that would just leave people more time to think about it. But the reality is, I used to be a direct mail consultant, and the reality is most people vote the first week or 10 days they get a ballot, and so, or an ask for money. So I'm hoping that there's a resolution of this. Having come out of the labor movement, I can tell you that there's lots of strike votes and strike notices and things, and you never have a strike. So I'll hope for that. I don't think, you know, obviously I'm a business person, lots of business people in the room. It can really affect you, and as well. But I'm completely confident Elections BC will take whatever measures they can, but we can't pull back advertising that we've
Well,
already
this is
booked.
exactly it. If it goes on for a long time,
Yeah.
we
It'll be-
don't have the money. We need more money.
I know what I want for Christmas, my ballot, yeah.
Just to let folks know, we've got time for a couple more questions, and I will give both of you about a minute or so to do a little wrap-up summary when we get to that point. Sir?
Hi there. I was listening to Mr. Tieleman, and I noticed there was a lot of rhetoric and fear-mongering. In fact, you brought up the word Nazi, which I thought was really clever. I did notice there was a lot of correlation that you were trying to say. This country's bad and they have PR. This country's bad and they have PR. But you didn't bring on a causation. You weren't able to say that PR caused the problem, just that the country has the problem. Do you have any other evidence that shows that PR causes problems, or are you just trying to bring forward that correlation and hoping everybody just gets scared?
Well, I appreciate, sorry, Dan.
Yep, go ahead. No, I'm just gonna, because I'm gonna
Yep.
also flip that, Maria, to say, what does proportional representation fix? What problem does it solve? So,
Sure.
Bill,
Yeah.
first on,
I appreciate the question. The reality is that proportional representation does not cause extremism. It enables extremism. It allows extremists into legislatures with a level of support that would not get them anywhere otherwise. That's the biggest problem we have. They would not get elected in Kelowna or in Vancouver or anywhere else on their platform. But they can get elected under proportional representation systems, even with a 5% threshold. We look at the United Kingdom. In 2015, you remember UKIP party, the United Kingdom Independence Party, and crazy Nigel Farage. He got 12.5% of the vote, but it was first past the post. Out of 650 ridings in the United Kingdom, they won 1 seat. If it was proportional, they would have had, let me finish, if it was proportional, they would have had 80 to 90 seats and been a major force in there. In the next election, they were washed up and down to 1.5%. So that's first past the post, and that's how it deals with the extremists. Then we look at Germany, as I've mentioned, 94 seats. So, but they could only win 3 ridings in Germany, couldn't win any ridings, the New Zealand First Party. So first past the post deals with extremists because it makes them campaign in their own ridings, and when people look at them, they say, no thanks.
Maria?
I'm less inclined to, I mean, I could pull a bunch of stats around, again, I mentioned Germany has the strongest economy. I'm not willing to say that that's in Europe, that I'm not willing to say that's because it's a pro-rep system. You look at the sort of the happiness index, you look at all these economic indicators, the Scandinavian countries always rank really, really high. Again, is that because they have a pro-rep system? I think there's multiple factors at play. For me, I think I prefer to look at BC and how frustrated people are here with politics and how divisive our political system is, and I think that proportional representation could help to address that. What I'll say as well is I have an issue with looking at how pro-rep is working in other jurisdictions. I mean, I think New Zealand is an interesting example, notwithstanding some of Bill's quotes there, but part of, for me, what is appealing about this is us moving to this system, is having a democratic process, which I recognize is flawed and needs to improve. But the fact that people can have a say in their voting system. We did not pick our current voting system. We did not have a say in our current voting system. We have an opportunity now to place our vote and to have a say in how we decide to elect our governments. And I think that in and of itself is a very valuable thing.
But we did have an opportunity, Maria, in 2009, and we chose the system we have right now. We rejected proportional, and now we're doing it all over
Well,
again.
the issue hasn't gone away because people are still dissatisfied with politics. So I think as long, and we're actually seeing increasing sort of disruption in our political system. As I mentioned, New Brunswick and Quebec, I think that there's more and more evidence of first past the post not working in multi-party political environments.
It's interesting about issues not going away. One of the items within the policy that was adopted, put forward by the Kelowna Chamber, but adopted by the BC Chamber, called for a supermajority, which is exactly what's required by any BC Chamber resolution, because at least you decide the issue and it's clear where you are, and so we don't face the same year after year. So that's one of the fundamental principles, and there's lots of evidence, even within provincial legislation, of where a supermajority makes sense. We have one more question, then we're going to wrap up.
I take exception to the suggestion that people are thinking that their vote doesn't count. I believe people really do believe that their vote counts, those who don't have voter apathy. And I challenge the suggestion, well, I think you've made some great points. I challenge the suggestion that those who are currently cynical, you mentioned voter cynicism, that would change under proportional representation. I think that voter apathy is a bigger issue. And I think when you have a process that is suggesting that there's a solution to voter cynicism and potentially then voter apathy, but yet you have a system that is out there trying to run a referendum where there is no great knowledge. I've come to chamber lunches, this is the smallest one I've been to, for such an important cause. So for me, that's a big, it's a red flag for me about unproportional representation.
Yeah,
So-
I don't think it's going to solve all of it. I agree with you. I'm very alarmed that the 2/3, the 65% who think elected officials don't care what people like them think. So I don't think this is all solved by pro-rep. I think we're in a bit of a vicious cycle in which some of the voter apathy that I think is caused by our current system, not just our voting system, but our political institutions and the way that they behave, is partly why we have low voter engagement to begin with. So how do we get people engaged in a structure, in a system that that has a lot of these flaws? I think we need a more robust engagement process around this, absolutely. And I think if we had a coalition government and a pro-rep system, we have a minority. We don't have a coalition government right now. We would likely have a better process as well. So I mean, I'm not going to change your mind, and I get that, and I don't think it's going to cure all that ails us. I think it needs to raise some serious alarms around the state of our democracy. That's what I would say. And I think some of the rise of radicalism is actually fed by growing inequality and people's sort of rejection of our current democratic institutions. And whether that's pro-rep or some other kind of democratic renewal, we really do need to address that.
Real quick, Bill.
But yeah, Dan, I mean, you raised the important point, which I should have raised before. There is no threshold in this referendum. If 20% vote and 11% vote in favor of proportional and another 5 or 6% are in favor of one system, we're changing our system. There should be a threshold of participation, and 50% plus one, as you just mentioned, is not adequate. It was 60% in the previous two referendums, plus 60% of ridings voting in favor to ensure
There's
regional
no threshold
votes.
for voting for our
No,
governments
but
right now
this is changing how every government is elected, Maria. Every government, and there should be a participation threshold, and we should have. In my strata council, I'm the strata council president. I need a 75% vote to change my furnace, and I can change my democracy with less than 20% voting and 50% plus one. Doesn't make any sense to me.
So, Maria, I'd like you to comment, and then I'm going to come to our
Well,
final
I
question.
mean-
With respect to just look at the overall turnout, people even suggestion of voter fatigue because we've got municipal elections coming, and then they have to turn around. And so, in all likelihood, the eligible number of voters is going to be small. And then three-way split. How does any government, and I know this is not pertaining to your official role in the pro and the con side, but both are political strategists, how does any government move forward if there's not a clear mandate or a result?
I think that's going to be an issue. If we're able to be successful in getting proportional representation approved, I think there needs to be, whether it's a citizens' assembly or some kind of robust process on the other side, to engage the public and to make sure that the decisions around what the system looks like and how it operates is being made with British Columbians. Because I agree it's an issue. But I mean, right now, we're electing governments with sometimes as low as 32% that are in charge of multi-billion-dollar budgets. So I think that's also a problem. And so we need an overhaul. City of Vancouver is likely to elect a mayor with 20,000 people voting for them. So there's a lot of issues.
So somewhere along the line, we'll have a forum about whether it should be a requirement under law that everyone cast a ballot, because that might solve the issue. But I want to get down that path. We have one more question, and then we'll...
This new system, if it passes, what are the projections of it costing on an annual basis going forward versus our system of government now?
Well, we've done some looks at that, and I think the Fraser Institute may have done something, but I mean, I think anytime you have more politicians, more politics, more division, more coalitions, more talks, there's an office set up for this current government for liaison with the Green Party. I think you're looking at more costs, but that said, I'm not an alarmist about that. I mean, I think the real area where you'd have more costs are where you're trying to cobble together agreement on different issues where everybody has their own, their own little earmarking that they want to do for their riding or their area or whatever, and that kind of thing can cost us more money. But ultimately, if the cost of democracy itself is minor compared to the cost of government.
So we are conscious that everybody in the room is taking their responsibility seriously. So on behalf of the Kelowna Chamber, thank you all for gathering here. We had a mayoral candidate forum last week. We had a big turnout. I'm thinking we'll do a business in cannabis, because that's the biggest turnout we've ever had, and I think we should do it again. But with that said, on both occasions, we did provide an opportunity to wrap up, and I didn't mention off the top, but I will give you a little bit of time, if you could take 30 seconds, a minute, and just to, if people want more information, where they can get it, and just one final. And we started with you, Maria, so I'll start with Bill, just to wrap things up.
Well, thanks again, and I didn't realize this is one of the smallest crowds, because for Maria and I, it's one of the bigger ones. That's kind of sad about our democratic system, but it is actually. And I'm glad that the media are here, because they play an important role in educating the voters on this. I urge everyone to find out about this. I said at the beginning, I'll say at the end, proportional representation, you've heard it here, is complicated and confusing. It is a system which would guarantee perpetual minority governments. It is a system that would empower extremists with a minority, 5% or so of the vote, to be in our legislature. Those are all reasons to reject this. All of the decision making that's going to happen will happen of important decisions like ridings and how the system would work and how many MLAs per riding will all happen after the referendum vote, and it will happen with the majority of members of those legislative committees formed by the NDP and the Greens, so the parties in power will make the rules. I don't think that's a good way to proceed in any event. Maria mentioned having a citizens' assembly after the fact. If there was ever going to be one, it should have been before this referendum, not after it.
Maria?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and the Chamber for hosting. And I echo Bill. I appreciate the engagement on the issue. Obviously, I think it's an important one. The question is whether or not we change our system. And for many people, the answer to that is no, things are working fine. But for a lot of British Columbians, they're not working fine, and people are frustrated with our political systems and with what they see as politicians who put their parties ahead of public interest. And I think we can do better than that. I think this is an opportunity for us to strengthen our democracy, to bring in a system that is necessarily more collaborative, that reduces the partisan divisiveness and bickering that we see in Victoria, and that creates an environment that ensures sort of longer-term, thoughtful policy making that's in the interest of all British Columbians. So I encourage you to do the research that you need to make an informed decision. Again, by being in this room, I think you're already sort of ahead of the pack. But also in ensuring your friends and neighbors get that ballot back in the mail, assuming there's not a postal strike. But again, I think we can. I think our democracy has been evolving for decades, for centuries, and I don't think that we should stop here. I think that we're at a critical time in our society in general. We're facing the complexity of issues that need as many good brains on solving them as possible, and I don't see the current political environment providing for that. So thank you for taking the time today, and I hope that you consider voting for Pro-Rep.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a big round of applause for Maria Dobrinskaya, Bill Tieleman, for joining us today.